to Many Voices, and today we're going to be focusing on women's issues. I have a fantastic guest, Dr. Laura Silberstein, who I'll turn to and talk with in a moment. We'll be exploring compassion in women's issues in addition to some other topics. But I want to say that one of the things that I'm super excited about is the Women's Boot Camp that's happening August 16 through 19. And part of our inspiration for doing this series of interviews with women is to highlight that boot camp, but also to really tune into women's issues and pay attention to what's happening to women today and how we're moving forward and trying to take action in the service of equality. So I'm going to spend some time chatting with Laura, and we hope you'll join us for the interview, but also join us at the Women's Boot Camp in San Diego. It's going to be super exciting, and Laura will be our wrap-up speaker. And so we're really looking forward to what she has to say, and she'll be focusing on compassion there too. So with that, I'll go ahead and begin. So welcome, Laura. We're super happy to have you here doing an interview with us. Thanks for giving us your time today. One of the things I wanted to do when I started the interview was just highlight you a little bit and connect to some of the work that you've done around compassion. I know you've written about it. Would you please share a little bit about some of the things that you've written, just so we can make people alert to your background and some of the work you've done?
Oh, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Robyn. I also just want to take a moment and thank you for having me here today, and Praxis for creating this context for all these different voices. It's just a fabulous endeavor, and I just look forward to this conversation today. But I'll start with a little self-promotion, something I'm practicing at. So the books that we've written, I've had the honor of writing a couple of books, one primarily on the science for compassion, an ACT practitioner's guide to the science of compassion and ACT. And so we've been looking at kind of how training the compassionate mind overlaps with training psychological flexibility. And that book was a wonderful endeavor with my partner, Dr. Dennis Tirch, as well as Benji Schorndorf, one of my co-authors there. And that was a really wonderful kind of process to look at the integration and bringing some of the compassionate science to ACT. And then another book that I was honored to be a part of also with Dr. Dennis Tirch, my partner, and Russell Colt, was on Buddhist psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy, looking at the integration of and even juxtaposition of Buddhist psychology and cognitive behavioral therapies. So looking at the family of cognitive behavioral therapies, how we've been evolving, and really how so much of the processes that we all kind of tend to fall into tend to come out of some of the work in terms of Buddhist psychology and long-standing practices of training the mind in service of becoming more flexible, I'd say.
Well, these are wonderful books, and part of why we wanted you to come and share your experience, not the whole reason, but part of why we wanted you to come and share experience. There's two other great reasons that I can think of, and one is that you have been very interested in women's issues for a long time. You're currently, although we've just had new elections, the co-president of the Women in ACBS SIG, and you're just a fantastic person. And so, those three reasons together, I think, inspired us to have you come and be a speaker at the Women's Boot Camp in August. So I want to, given that compassion is your focus, Buddhist psychology, if you want to throw some of that in there too, I want to ask just a little bit about that, and how do you think compassion plays a role in women's empowerment?
That's a fabulous question. And well, my first thought is always like, well, how doesn't it? But if I rewind my thought process there and unpack it a little bit, it would start with kind of what we see the definition of compassion as, which is a sensitivity to suffering with a commitment to do something to prevent or alleviate that suffering in ourselves and in others. And so when I started getting interested, well, I've always been interested in women's issues. Kind of the moment I realized I was female and identified as a woman, but also having kind of been raised by an avid self-described feminist and aging hippie, my mother, I have a long kind of schooling in it. So looking at kind of compassion from that kind of feminist lens, looking at like, all right, there's kind of this suffering that has been going on for as long, really, since the dawn of kind of human history in terms of how we relate to one another, and how we kind of impose different socialization processes on each other. Now, evolutionary psychology might speak to kind of different demands and different demands from the environment that are placed on our different sexes via roles. But over time led to a lot of kind of discrimination, suffering, injustice, and we find ourselves here today with a really big awareness of this suffering. The Me Too movement, Time's Up movement, international and local women's movements and mass movements around the world have really highlighted this suffering that exists.
Yeah.
Compassion also has a pretty, has some stigma attached to it, has some stereotypes attached to it, just like genders. Compassion is often seen as warm, soft, kind of more communal and relational, being with somebody. And as I've studied compassion more, I've realized there's another face of compassion that's more agentic, that has this sense of kind of authority, courage, and strength, that is about kind of courageous engaging, creating change, and moving. And often when we think about kind of compassion, we think about that kind of warm, fuzzy, communal actions of compassion are often associated with women. And that more kind of agentic, authoritative kind of leadership style of compassion that's often more associated with men. However, what we know is that our individual differences are far smaller than they appear. And that compassion allows us to train up our minds in both of these areas, both the agentic and the communal. So I think compassion and compassionate mind training has a key role in women's empowerment for a couple of reasons. I think one is that for so long, because we've been trained up as this kind of communal, relational gender, that we're almost expected to be nurturing by default and to be able to give care and compassion to others. But when it comes to flipping that in the other way, receiving compassion from others or receiving compassion from ourselves, asking for compassion from others, there seem to be some significant blocks. In fact, the research, although mixed and varied, shows some trends in this direction, that women are less likely to report self-compassion, more likely to report self-judgment, self-condemnation. And while they are more likely to reach out for help in terms of mental health issues and therapy, there are some discrepancies there. Men will once it gets to a certain point. But even though they will reach out, difficulties in asking for help, specifically what one needs, and stepping outside of some of that stereotypical threat, has shown in the research to be difficult for women. So not only self-compassion, but also kind of receiving compassion from others. That's not to say that it's not difficult for men as well, but this is what the research is showing, and a lot of which is based on self-report data. So that speaks to kind of what women and men are willing to say in public versus what their actual experience is. So getting more into kind of what our experiences of compassion are and how we're trained into or out of certain aspects of it, I think is a big part of it.